Thank you. I'm going to get my face off the screen. There we go. So I want to say, first of all, thanks to the Montana Securities Commission for having me here. It's my first time in Montana, my first time in Bozeman. Oh my God, it makes me miss Colorado. So before I moved to DC about 18 months ago, I have been living in Denver for almost 30 years. Getting out this morning to run and see the mountains really makes me miss living in that kind of environment. But I do love DC. I will also say I'm a city girl as well. So as Jim said, I'm the director of the Small Business Advocacy Office at the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's how we shorten our very long name. But much like I did, if you heard me on the radio this morning, before I get started, I have to say, I am here in my capacity as the director. The views I express today are my own. They do not reflect the views of the commission, the commissioners, or any of my colleagues on the staff. So they don't let me get up on stage. They don't let any of us get up on stage unless we say that. Let me move forward. So a little bit of a roadmap. So first of all, oh my God, they put the lawyer, the government lawyer, in the middle of the afternoon. The government lawyer who used to be a law professor. You guys, I hope you had some sugar on that break. I hope you got some cookies or some fruit because you're going to need them. So this is a roadmap of what I want to talk a little bit about today. First of all, my goal is really, I want you to know this office exists. One of the reasons we come out and do public speaking engagements is because a lot of people don't even know that this office exists at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So that's one of my goals today. My second goal is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the regulatory pathways. How do small businesses go about raising capital? And how does that intersect with where I come into the mix working for the agency? I also am going to bore you with some data and statistics about small business capital formation. Hopefully you won't be bored by it. And then I'm going to introduce you to some of the resources that not only our office has created, we can't take all the credit, but other offices at the agency also create educational resources, and I'm going to introduce you to those as well. So I am a professor, so if you want to interrupt me along the way, it's not going to bother me at all. Just throw your hand up in the air, and I'll pause in the middle and get back to it. So who is this Small Business Advocacy Office? Because like I said, most people don't even know that we exist. So we are an independent office within the agency. So what is that? And I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. So what does the Securities and Exchange Commission? What's its mission? It's there to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. So it has a three-part mission. I think for a lot of people, when they hear the SEC, first of all, when I get up on stage sometimes, I get two questions. People want to flee the room, my office doesn't regulate, and we don't enforce. And then the next question I get is, how do I get money from you? Well, I work for the Securities and Exchange Commission. We don't have any money to give. My colleague, the person from the SBA, who I think is no longer in the room, they have money to give you. We don't have any money to give away. But a lot of times for people, they hear about the SEC because they read the news and they hear about enforcement actions. The SEC is pursuing cases against somebody. But the agency is there to do a lot more than just bring enforcement actions. They really are there to facilitate capital and to protect investors. And so I like to highlight that. And when you think about the office that I direct, we really come in under that third prong, that idea of facilitating capital formation. So again, let me see, I get confused when there are the two slides on the screen. I'm like, which one am I talking to? So we have a really long title. We're the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation. I made a joke of it a couple weeks ago in a speech. I used some Jeopardy references, and one of my Jeopardy questions was, what office at the SEC has the longest title? And it is absolutely us. We were established by Congress, bipartisan legislation in 2016. So it's a relatively new office. It didn't come into existence until 2019. So my predecessor, Martha Legg Miller, there are big shoes to fill. She was the first director of the Small Business Advocacy Office. I have the privilege of being the second director of the office, and I've been there for about 18 months. And I'd like to talk about what small businesses mean to us, because everybody has a different opinion of what is a small business. So when I think about it and when we talk about it from the perspective of where I work, a small business is a startup, a company that's just opened its doors, to a company that has up to $250 million in market capitalization. That's a really big swath of businesses that our office is there to be an advocate for and to work with and to help them. And I'm going to put on my glasses so that maybe I look at my notes now and then instead of just winging it. And we take a different approach. So obviously, the way we interact with a very small business, a startup that's really just thinking about that first capital raise, is different than the resources and what we can do to advocate for a small public company that's trading on an exchange and has $250 million in market capitalization. So our mission is to advocate for small businesses and our investors. So what does that really mean? That's a really lofty goal, but what do we actually do? So one of the things that we do is we analyze capital raising trends, and we look at the impact that securities laws and rules have on small business capital formation. So we're always paying attention to what's happening within our own building, what are proposed rules that might be coming out, thinking about are there impacts to small businesses, and when I say small businesses, I'm talking about that wide swath. One of the things I joked about this morning on the radio show that we've been doing a lot of, there are 40+ pieces of proposed legislation right now out of the House Financial Services Committee. That is a lot of legislation. I'm just going to say we're an office of 12, including me. But one of the things that we do is we analyze all of those pieces of legislation, and we think about what is the impact to small business capital formation. Another piece of what we do in our role is we provide technical assistance. So Congress can come to our office and say, we'd like you to provide technical assistance on this proposed legislation. That doesn't mean we weigh in on the policy aspects. It just means we try and help them understand how these pieces of proposed legislation might fit within the framework that already exists. And then we go out and we engage. We engage with small business founders, we engage with investors, we engage with parties that support them. So we do a lot of engagement with entrepreneurial support organizations. So you heard a lot of talk about incubators and accelerators. We spend a lot of time talking to them because they're so critical to supporting the small business ecosystem. And that, whether they're out there on their own and they're just a nonprofit, or maybe they're affiliated with a university. So we work with them a lot. And we gather lots of information and voices, and we bring those back, and we try and be the voice for the small business founders and investors, not just with the commission, but also with Congress. So that's really what our role is, to be that advocate. All right, sorry, too many pages. One of the things that we do with all that information we learn is we put together an annual report every year. I would have brought them, but it would have weighed too much and the airlines wouldn't have let me through. And they're getting a little bit old because it's our 2024 annual report. But we have recommendations in there, and those recommendations are data-driven. So they're based on data that we collect throughout the year, not just internally, but externally. And they're based on the voices that we hear. So we make recommendations to the commissioners of my agency, to Congress, about proposed changes they might think about when it comes to small business capital formation to help support businesses. And then last but certainly not least, is we try and help founders and investors navigate complex securities laws. So anyone that's a lawyer in this room knows the securities laws are complex. Anyone who's not a lawyer thinks, oh my God, what did I get myself into when I decided that I was going to raise dilutive capital? Meaning I was going to actually take investors, which means I have to have some kind of basic understanding about the securities laws. I should have a good lawyer, should probably have a good accountant as well. But if I'm going to raise capital, a small founder also needs to have some basic understanding of the securities laws. And so one of the things that we do is we have a lot of resources that we put together to help on that front. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the pathways to raising capital. And I'm going to try and keep it. Okay, so it's not a countdown, it's more what time is it in the room. All right. So one of the things that you heard with the early panel is not everybody raises capital from investors. So this is our funding roadmap. So this is one of the resources on our site, and it talks about the different ways that small businesses raise capital. So one of the things that we know is most small businesses raise their first capital, a lot of times from the founders themselves. They put their own money into the business to get it up and going. But many times, founders don't have enough capital to continue to bootstrap on their own. They need to look to other sources to keep the business running, to keep things sustainable. So the first place they often go is to external capital. And when I say external capital, I'm not jumping just right into somebody's making an investment. I'm talking about they're looking for grants and loans. So they're talking to organizations like SBAs or community banks or local banks or even bigger banks. They're looking for non-dilutive capital. And what I mean there is they're going to take capital, but they're not going to dilute their ownership interest. Those founders are going to maintain that ownership interest when they take this non-dilutive capital. But that's not really where our agency and where our office comes into play. Where we step into the mix is when founders are starting to think about raising capital from investors, and they're going to sell an ownership stake in their business to get that capital. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to highlight this again later, but only 2% of small businesses take on equity investments. That is very, very tiny. And I apologize for not having it memorized off the top of my head, but I think it's something like, of that 2%, about only 8% comes from VCs. So not very many people are getting money from VCs. So it's a very small slice of the pie, but that's really where the Securities and Exchange Commission comes into play, where the securities laws come into play, and where our office tries to serve a role in helping deconstruct those complex securities laws. Now, I also, my team would be angry at me if I didn't say, we can't give legal advice. But I am going to give some legal advice. The best thing you can do as a founder, find a good lawyer. You really need a lawyer at some point. You don't want to go it on your own because you don't want to run afoul of the federal securities laws. You don't want to run afoul of the state securities laws. You have sort of a dual regime that might apply to you. So I know sometimes we think it's painful to think about paying for lawyers and accountants. They're expensive professionals in this world. But believe it or not, it's a wise thing to do. And I was having a conversation yesterday with Carter, sort of a little bit of the same thing. We were talking about insurance. Everybody feels like, oh my gosh, I need insurance. I'm paying all this money for something I never use. But when you need to use it, it's really going to matter that it's there. All right. So this is another one of our resources. This comes from what are called our building blocks. And I promise you at the end of my talk today, I will tell you how you access all of our resources. But again, this is one of the things we try and do is help founders understand, okay, I'm thinking about raising dilutive capital, investment capital. What do I need to think about? So this goes back to sort of the idea of I need to put together my pitch deck. So I will say one of the things we're working on right now is a resource to help people understand the basics of a pitch deck, but this does it in its own way. So this is really meant to help founders understand what are the things that I should be thinking about if I'm going to raise capital. So I'm not going to highlight them all, but as a founder, you better know who already has an ownership stake in your company, and you better be able to put that together in the form of a cap table. Now, we live in a beautiful world where there is software out there that's even free that will allow you to create a cap table. You don't have to do the calculations yourself. You can drop the numbers in. It's going to run all the percentages for you, but you want to have a cap table that's reflective of the ownership structure of your business. The other thing you want to think about if you're a company is how much money do I need to raise? You need to give some thought to how much money do I actually need and how long is that money going to last me? Am I looking for money to last me 12 months, 18 months, 24 months? What does that look like? You need to be able to speak to that. And as you're speaking to that, you need to be able to convince people about your business plan and why they should give you that money to help you get past that runway. So you need to be able to articulate that long-term vision. And then, as I said, you need good advisors. You really do at some point. And they don't necessarily always have to be lawyers or accountants, accelerators, incubators. I don't think I've heard anyone say it in here, but a lot of law schools have community economic development clinics or small business clinics. They are often there to help small startups as well. So looking for those kind of resources. All right, so I mentioned most founders, they take the cash out of their own pocket to get their business up and started out of the gate. And then the next place they look is maybe their friends and family. So guess what? I cannot tell you, and I was having this conversation earlier, how many times I have a founder say to me, oh, I sold an ownership stake to my friends and family. That's not a security right. Ding, ding, ding. Yes, you just sold a security. And that means you need to comply with the securities laws. And so I think we live in this world where there's a little bit of a misperception. Oh, I just sold to my friends and family. Hopefully they still like you and they're not going to sue you and you're going to be okay. And you probably did everything okay. But just sort of one of our goals is to help people understand where do these laws come into the mix so they can appreciate that they need to comply with them. Next up, businesses, they look to angel investors. So angel investors put in, sort of that pre-seed round of money about 30% of the time. I'll talk a little bit more. Equity crowdfunding came up earlier. I'll share some data about crowdfunding and how little crowdfunding is used. Spoiler alert there. And then, as I said, venture capital. Very few small businesses, get venture capital money. And it's interesting to me, so sometimes I bring in my world of practice as well. So while I was a professor, I was also assisting small businesses raising capital. And so many small businesses want venture capital money. They just think it's the be-all, end-all, and it's probably not. There are other places to get your capital first. All right. You didn't know you were going to get a law school lecture. So, what is the role of the SEC? Spill the water. All right, so Congress created a framework in 1933. Did I mention there's a quiz later? There'll be a little quiz about all these things, so if you want to start taking notes, I'm kidding. So the SEC, well, actually the agency itself, again, former professor, the agency itself did not come into existence until 1934, but our first securities laws came into existence in 33. Why does this even matter? Because out of the gate, the securities law said, every offer and sale of a security has to either be registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I like to say initial public offering. Almost everyone in the room has an understanding that's a registered offering. Or it has to be conducted pursuant to an exemption from the registration requirements. And that is how most small companies raise their capital. And quite honestly, it's how a lot of large companies raise their capital these days. We'll take a look at some of the data and we'll see that raising capital privately is much more commonplace now than doing a public offering and raising capital in the public markets and then trading. So again, that's going to hold true across the board. So if every offer and sale of a security has to either be registered or exempt, it begs the question, what's a security? And I thought I might get asked this on the radio this morning, and I did not, which I was probably grateful for. But security is a very broad term. So I think everyone in this room knows common stock, preferred stock, those are securities. Those are sort of everyday terminology that we think about. A limited liability company interest might not be a security, but more times than not, it is. So a lot of people don't, because you think common stock, preferred stock, but an interest in an LLC is often a security. Other things that are securities, convertible notes. So a lot of people these days, common language, you have SAFE, a simple agreement for future equity, or a KISS note, keep it simple, security. The other thing that's popping up quite frequently, and I actually had a really interesting conversation with a woman a couple of weeks ago, revenue-based notes. So investing in a company and instead of getting paid back through revenue earnings, but many times a revenue-based note also falls into that category of security. Stock options, restricted stock, I could go on and on and on if you let me, but that would be a 14-week course. All right, so a little bit more. So again, just thinking about securities laws, I'm not going to pay much attention to this side over here, sort of how do you raise capital through a public offering. What I really want to focus on are those exempt offerings and how people are using them to raise capital. And again, that matters whether you're a small business, a big business. I think the other misperception that might exist is just because you're a public company, that does not preclude you from raising private capital. So you can be a public company, you can be trading on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, and you can still go out and do a private offering and raise capital privately and bring in investors that way. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the mix as well, is that you can mix and match these types of situations. All right, so let's talk about let's talk about the most common ways people raise capital. So one of the things I like to start with in this world, people talk about the friends and family rounds, Series A, pre-seed. That's not how we think about it if we're securities lawyers. We think about it in terms of the actual exemptions, and we talk about them in that parlance, so to speak. So Rule 506B, it is the most used pathway to raising capital. And it's the most used pathway not just by operating companies to raise capital for a business that's got operations, but also by pooled funds. So when you think about when we're talking about private equity firms or VC firms or small funds, and I'm going to get it wrong, was it Bear Capital? Did I get it right? Two Bear Capital. So I'm going to guess you have a fund. You've raised a fund to invest in businesses. So pooled funds are also big users of 506B. So under 506B, a company can raise as much capital as it wants. There's no dollar limit. For the most part, they're selling to what are called accredited investors, though they can sell to a handful of non-accredited investors. But one of the big caveats with this exemption is that if you're going to use it, you can't engage in general solicitation and advertising. And that can be really constraining on small businesses if they don't have enough of a network and know enough investors to be able to bring them into the mix. So that's where 506C comes into play. So it's a more recent twist under Regulation D, which is sort of the encompassing rule there. So 506C, again, allows a company to raise as much capital as it wants. It can only raise that capital from accredited investors. It can engage in general solicitation and advertising. But here's the caveat with 506C. The company has to make sure and certify that every one of those investors is an accredited investor. Meaning, basically, most companies don't do it on their own. They hire a third party to do it, but they have to ensure that they meet one of the standards within the accredited investor definition, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then I don't like to give short shrift to poor Rule 504. Nobody uses 504, or hardly anyone uses 504. But it allows a company to raise up to $10 million in a 12-month period, and it's generally going to be a raise of capital from people that they know. But what I can tell you, not just from a practicing lawyer, but in my role now, very few people rely on Rule 504 to raise capital. And then to round out some of the other pathways that people are using, we've got crowdfunding. So when I say crowdfunding, I'm not talking about raising money. So I'm old, I'm going to date myself. So probably many of you don't remember an early crowdfund. Somebody raised money to make a potato salad. They were going to make their potato salad. That is not equity crowdfunding. The securities laws don't govern this idea of you're raising capital because you're going to send everyone your potato salad. We won't think about how that happened. Or you raised capital because you want to make a movie and you're going to give everyone access to a digital version of the movie. When we talk about crowdfunding, from our perspective, we're talking about you again. You're selling an ownership interest in your business through regulation crowdfunding. It allows you to raise $5 million in a 12-month period, but you have to do it through a portal, or basically you have to do it through the internet. You have to do it online. There are limitations to the amount of money that a non-accredited investor can invest in a crowdfund offering, but accredited investors can invest as much as they want. I'll do one of my spoilers right now. So I went back and looked at our capital raising maps. There were 2 crowdfund offerings in the state of Montana in 2024. So there were only 2. And then I'll share some national data as we move through this discussion. So another pathway is the intrastate offering. I'm also going to tell you very few people use the intrastate offering. So I also like to differentiate, because Kirsten mentioned this as well. So sometimes state crowdfunding, so state-based crowdfunding, kind of falls into that category of the intrastate offering versus federal crowdfunding, which can be done federally. But there are other ways that you raise capital and you only raise it from investors that are sitting in one particular state. So there's a federal regulation that governs there, but what really matters when you're engaged in intrastate offerings is what does each individual state have on its laws and what can you do? So as somebody who was living in Colorado for almost 30 years, as I mentioned, I can tell you in the state of Colorado, If you want to do an intrastate offering, not an intrastate crowd fund, you can make 20 offers and have 10 purchasers. That's not going to get you a lot of money. I can offer my securities to 20 people in the state of Colorado, and 10 of them can buy. So again, this is a pathway that doesn't get used much. Regulation A, I hear a lot about Regulation A. If you follow the news, a lot of people are talking about Regulation A. It's sometimes called the mini IPO. There was hopes when Regulation A was revamped not so long ago that it would become more utilized. It also is not a pathway that is used very frequently, but I still think there's a lot of talk out there, and another spoiler alert, there were no Reg A offerings in the state of Montana in 2024. There were very few Reg A offerings anywhere in the United States in 2024. And then obviously, last but not least, you can do a public offering, but again, we're there to support small public companies, but the bulk of our focus is more on companies raising private capital. All right, that was a lot. Is everyone still awake? Do you need another cookie? Are there more cookies over there? Should we pass them around? Or candy? I know there's candy on the table because I helped myself to a fair amount of that. All right, so we have what's called a navigator tool on our website, and we like to refer to it as a choose your own adventure tool. So if you are a founder, you can come to the navigator tool, you answer 8 questions. And after you answer those 8 questions, it's going to come back and say, these are the 3 different regulatory pathways that might make the most sense for you based on what you've told us. So some of those, what this slide is doing here is just talking about some of those introductory questions to our navigator tool, because they're gonna help small founders decide, well, what's gonna work best for us? And so I'm gonna talk a little bit about each of these petals on the screen. I want you to know I am not creative at all. I can take no credit for these beautiful images on these PowerPoint slides. My team does this. I don't have that capability. All right, so one of the first things that I mentioned this in a different way, how much money do you need? Why does it matter? Because depending on how much money you need might impact which offering exemption is available to you. So as I mentioned, 506B and C, you can raise as much money as you want, so you don't have to worry about that. But maybe you only need $1 million. So you're gonna think about, well, maybe I'm gonna try a crowdfund offering. I know I can raise up to $5 million in crowdfunding in a 12-month period. So maybe I'm gonna go down that pathway. So just understanding how much you need is really important. As you can see a little bit from this diagram, and there's way too much on this slide, 506B and C, it shows up everywhere. But one of the things I can tell you that's not necessarily reflected up here, but we know from internal data, is that very few companies use a 506C offering if they're raising less than $1 million. So 506C, you're gonna see that trending up. And then I'm also gonna tell you that I always like to share a little bit of public company data. Very few companies do a public offering if they're not raising at least $75 million. So I'm old enough to say, and I used to do public offerings before the internet bubble burst, $75 million would have been a lot of money to do a public offering back in the 90s, but nowadays it feels like nothing when we think about billion-dollar offerings. All right, something else that founders have to consider, and this goes back to general solicitation and advertising. I can tell I don't live in a climate where it's dry anymore. Now I live where it's so humid, it's miserable, sorry. Sorry, DC. So another factor founders need to think about is, how am I gonna get my investors? Do I have a really big network? Do I know a lot of people that can come into my offering and give me capital? Or am I gonna need to engage in general solicitation and advertising? And that's gonna matter, because depending on whether you need to general solicit or not is going to impact which pathway to raising capital is available to you. So if you need to engage in general solicitation, 506B is not going to be the pathway for you because you are not able to engage in general solicitation, whereas a 506C offering would allow you to do that. What is general solicitation? It's the idea of making a communication that conditions the market. So it's kind of the idea of you're out there sort of touting yourself. you're touting the company, you're trying to get people interested in it. So what does that look like? In the olden times, it might have been a radio ad, but I was on a live radio show this morning. Now, maybe it's an unrestricted internet website, a newspaper, TV, seminars, text. I cannot tell you how many texts I get, or maybe it pops up on my Instagram feed. I don't sleep well, so I peruse Instagram a lot in the middle of the night. But thinking about all of these different ways that media comes at us now, but those are general solicitations. And so founders need to be cognizant of that when they're raising capital, and they need to understand, how am I going to find my investors? So I talked about this a little bit already. It matters because they might be prohibited, particularly if they're doing a 506B. So how do you avoid general solicitation? This is a question that comes up a lot. And one of the things I haven't said yet is we have an educational resource on almost every one of these points that I'm highlighting right now. And our educational resources are designed for founders. They're not designed for lawyers. So go out there and take a look at them. They're meant to try and help break down the complex securities laws. I want to do a 506B. I, being the founder, I have to have what's called a pre-existing substantive relationship with every investor that comes into my offering. That is what prevents you from not being engaged in general solicitation when you're doing a 506B offering. So that's something that's important to keep in mind when you head down that pathway. Another thing that really matters, are my investors going to be all accredited? It's going to make your life a lot easier if your pool of investors are all accredited investors. It's going to open up a lot of other potential pathways to you that might not otherwise exist. Or do I want to bring in some non-accredited investors? I used to run into this with my former clients because they would always be like, almost all my investors are accredited, but I have a couple of friends and family that want to participate. I want to let them in. They're not accredited. Well, that sort of pushes you into that 506B category or some other pathways, depending on how much you're raising. So understanding your type of investors and who's coming in the door is also going to play a role. So as I mentioned with 506C, they all have to be accredited. 506B, you can have 35 non-accredited investors. Now again, remember, you can't engage in general solicitation or advertising, so that can become a little bit difficult. But that's another one of the threshold questions that really matters. The other reason it matters is whether someone's accredited or not. In crowdfunding, there are limits on how much investment a non-accredited investor can make in a crowdfund offering. That also shows up in Regulation A as well. How does somebody become accredited? Wealth. For most of us in this room, wealth is what's going to push you into that accredited investor status. So for instance, you make $200,000 a year, you've made it the past 2 years, you think you're going to make it this year, or $300,000 if you're counting jointly with your spouse. Thank you. Thank you very much. Or you have $1 million in net worth. So that is the typical way that most people become accredited, but also there are some licensing ways. So if you hold one of the series exams, that might also make you an accredited investor. When we're talking about entities, it's a little bit different, but usually it's also sort of monetarily based. How many assets do they own or hold, or how many assets do they have under management? That's what's going to push them into that accredited investor category. And then lastly, where are my investors? So this matters mostly because as we talked about the intrastate offering, wow, you're only going to be able to take investors from one state. But it matters beyond that as well. Because when you're raising capital, you still need to know where your investors are because you still need to be thinking about the state securities laws, or that you need to make state filings where those investors are. But why it really matters, again, if you're doing an intrastate offering, all of your investors are going to need to come from that state, so you're going to need to have access to that information as well. All right, let's talk about some data. I'm a nerd. So I also happen to have, the prior speaker, I have a PhD in education. I know it's ridiculous, but I worked at a university. It was almost free. to go get my PhD. But one of the things I loved was statistics and data. And we really liked, so all of these slides come out of our annual report. So one of the things that I think is nice about the area that I work in and everyone in this room, everybody, almost everybody loves small businesses. Almost everybody wants to support small businesses and try and find a way to help them succeed. I feel like it's a universal thing no matter what. And that's really incredible to me. And we hear it all the time. Small businesses are the backbone of America. We have some data to back it up. Since 2011, 80% of net new jobs have been created by small businesses. That's pretty incredible when you think about it. There are lots of huge businesses out there, but it's those really small businesses that are thriving and helping the economy grow. But access to capital, you're all sitting in this room. We hear it every day in our job. It is the most difficult things, one of the most difficult things is to get access to capital that you need. Did it not advance? There we go. So we hear 77% of small business founders are worried about getting the capital that they need. That's a lot. That's a really huge percentage. I will also tell you, it's not up on my slides, most small businesses are almost half are only looking for about $50,000. They're only looking for about $50,000 to get started, yet 77% are still worried about being able to find that capital and get their doors open. I find that discouraging. So we talked a little bit about this. Where does capital come from? So only about 40% of the time do small businesses look for external capital. And most of the time when they're looking for external capital, they're looking for a loan, they're looking for a credit line, or maybe a business credit card. So typically when they turn to external capital, that's where they're going. And I already gave my spoiler, only 2% of small businesses are actually received an equity investment. So more might be looking for it, but only about 2% actually got an equity investment, meaning they took on investors and they gave away an ownership percentage in their company. Again, it's a pretty small slice of the pie, but it's also a big slice of the pie when we think about it from a money perspective. All right, angel investors, I'm gonna try and speed up. I'm supposed to go to questions, I think, at 3:35, so I still have about 8 minutes. So angel investors play a really critical role. I mentioned this before, about 30% of capital for small businesses comes from angel investors. They make a lot of investments, but much like we've heard in this room, and much like our data will show you, investments are trending down across everything, whether it's from an angel investor, whether it's from a VC firm or a PE firm, investment trends are on the way down. The other thing I like to highlight about angels, they're really critical for being mentors. They're really supportive. And Bree's over here shaking her head. I know a lot of angel investors. I just got to speak at the Angel Capital Association conference. It is amazing. They don't just bring money to the table, they bring so much more, much like an entrepreneurial support organization does. Seed activity. No surprise, this is going to be true of every one of these slides. 2020 and 2021 were the highs. The height of COVID, lots of money was flowing out. It's dropped significantly, but the one thing I will say is it has started to level off. So even though it's come down from those highs, you can see from 23 to 24, we're starting to see a little bit of a leveling off, but the amount of cash and the number of deals being funded through seed funding has declined. The same is true with VC funding. Even more of a drop-off into 23 and 24, but again, we're starting to see some stabilization there and things leveling out, but the number of deals being done, the amount of capital being deployed is also decreasing. So this is one of my favorite slides. So here, $170 billion operating companies. So I'm just talking about operating companies there, not funds. Operating companies raised $170 billion in capital through a 506B offering. So what that tells you is they're going out there, they're raising capital mostly from accredited investors that they have a pre-existing substantive relationship. I'm not a regulator, so you're all safe in this room. Don't tell me what you've done or what you haven't done. But I like to pull that out. So I also want to highlight here, because crowdfunding came up, $249 million. So not very much capital was raised in crowdfunding. Rule 504 and Reg A, those dots are pretty small as well. And then over here, sort of other exempt offering pathways. So let's talk a little bit. So now I got to flip to see if I can find these notes, because I jotted down some notes about crowdfunding. All right, so in the first half of 2024, there were 713 new Form Cs filed. So when you do a crowdfund offering, you are legally supposed to file a Form C. Not everyone does, so I'm sure this number is low. But there were 713 of those. To give you a sense of where most crowdfunding happens: California, Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania. So those are the states that are doing the bulk of crowdfunding. I'll be honest with you, California, Texas, and Florida are going to be the states doing the bulk of raising private capital anyway. And then the other ones, sort of other states, come in and out of the mix. But the interesting thing about crowdfunding is one of the things we hear, it's hard. There are a lot of rules and regulations. You can raise up to $5 million. The average raise is about $368,000. People aren't using crowdfunding to raise a lot of money. And so someone, I can't remember who said it in the room, but there are very particular types of businesses that use crowdfunding. And again, they are ones that are probably in a community with a very loyal following, that everybody's really excited about them. They want to help support. Maybe they know the person, they know the business. And so that's one of the ways that crowdfunding does work. Regulation A, it's just sad. Regulation A is sad to me. I was one of those people that had high hopes when they revised Regulation A and they changed some of the rules around it and they raised the limits, but it just hasn't quite taken off. And I had a conversation with an attorney who actually does a fair amount of Reg A offerings recently, and she shared something very similar to crowdfunding. People are using Reg A because, again, they have a community that wants to support that company, and many times the investors in her Reg A offerings, they're okay investing with patient capital. They don't need a quick return because, again, it's the idea of they're supporting something that they're either passionate about or it's sort of that community support. And then, oh, this is just sad. IPOs and SPAC offerings, huge decline from 2021. Great on the SPACs. SPACs are on the uptick again. But the other thing that gives me a little bit of hope, and again, this is like my false hope because we heard it in 2024. We just heard it recently. But I will tell you, if you're watching the news, we are finally starting to see some IPOs happen again. So people are starting to do some initial public offerings. Probably not as many as we hoped, but they are starting to take off a little bit. All right. How do you find our really great stuff? So, as I joked on the radio show, don't be afraid to go to sec.gov. It's okay. You can go visit the website. You're going to be fine. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Any page on the sec.gov site has, it's hard to see, it's called Small Businesses. It's up there. They call it the eyebrow, so in the upper right corner. If you click on that link, it is going to bump you into our educational resources, some of which I've highlighted here. So we've got the roadmap, we've got the navigator tool, but what we also have, sort of our pride and joy, we call them our building blocks. And for anyone who's a lawyer, we call them one-pagers, kind of something you put together to study, to cram, to pass the test. So they're one-pagers and they cover very discrete topics. So we have a one-pager on accredited investors, we have a one-pager on general solicitation, we have a one-pager on private funds. So there are a lot of, and we try and organize them by stage of company. We also have one-pagers that are meant to help investors. So these are really great resources, not just for founders and investors, but anyone who's working with them and helping them. We have also created a legal glossary. We call it the Cutting Through the Legal Jargon of Capital Raising. So we've tried to take capital raising terminology, put it into everyday language. And the great thing about the glossary is once you get into a term, there are lots of other links that are going to take you to the building blocks, to other resources as well. You can see a picture of our most recent annual report. That's a little tribute. The cover is a little tribute to me as coming from the West to take this position, and the mountains and climbing and all of that good stuff. But I really encourage you, the annual report just has, for anybody who's thinking, needs data and wants to understand what's going on in small business capital formation. We put one out every year. It comes out in mid-December. I'll circle back to something I said early on. We're an independent office. We prepare this annual report. We're statutorily required to do it. We get to prepare it. No one gets to see it before we submit it to the commissioners to Congress. So not even within our own agency. We prepare this report. Now, that's not to say our Office of Public Affairs, who's helping us put this pretty thing together, but no one else gets to see it or weigh in on it or make changes to it. And that's part of what gives our independence at the agency. And again, this is a report. When you go to the back, you'll see that there are usually 4 to 6 recommendations. And again, that's us making recommendations based on the data we've discovered and also based on those voices we hear from founders and funders about the issues that they're encountering with small business capital formation. How do you engage with us? Oops. Oh, I think I left off a slide somewhere. Small business at sec.gov, or just come to our website. I'm also going to encourage you, sign up for our emails. We're not going to email very often. We don't sell your information either. We don't spam you, but we'll email you when we put out a new educational resource. The other thing we do, we call them our Let's Talk Small Business series. So we have little 10 to 15-minute interviews with experts in the field. The other thing that you'll find on our site, about a month ago, the SEC does what's called the Small Business Forum. My office is tasked with putting together that forum where we bring together the public, and they come and they talk about small business capital formation issues. So we get a lot of great panelists, and we have a startup panel, a middle, later stage, and then a public company panel. And then we had some little interviews in between with founders that we met over the course of last year. But with that, I will stop lecturing at you, and I will happily take questions if you're still awake. Or none.
What do you think about the adjustment to accredited investor requirements?
Sure. So I never answer personally. So I'll tell you what we hear. So first I'm going to start with, when I talked about those 40 pieces of legislation, I think there are probably about 5 or 6 of them that are around changing the definition of accredited investor to expand how many people can be accredited investor. Some of the ideas floating around are to create a test, a pathway for an individual who doesn't meet the wealth standards to become an accredited investor. There are other things floating around out there. I mean, it's definitely something that I will say has been on the radar. This is nothing new. People have been talking about changing the definition of accredited investor for a long time. Whether we see some movement on it or not, I don't know, but it's certainly floating around out there. You know, I mean, it's an issue that our stakeholders raise with us, that they wonder, you know, if accredited investors were broader, or there was a way for, when we think about, maybe I'll just say for non-accredited investors to take a test to establish their sophistication so that they could participate in more of these deals. Would that open up the ability for companies to be able to more easily raise capital? I wish I had a magic wand and I knew the answer to that question. But I mean, I will say, if it's something that matters to you, you know, think about talking to your local congresspeople and your senators. We haven't seen legislation on small business capital formation come out of the Senate yet. I'm told probably sometime early fall we'll see their bill. But if you go back and take a look at Senator Scott's Empowering Main Street Act from last session, you'll get a sense. But definitely accredited investors on the radar. So if you care, write a letter to your congresspeople or talk to them.
Stacy, how long were those standards, when were those standards established? Inflation's been pretty big, so when they came out.
The accredited investor thresholds were established in the 80s. It's been a long time. They've never been inflation adjusted. It is. It's, and I'm not going to remember off the top of my head the percentage of people who are accredited now versus when that came into existence. but it's a very huge increase.
I testified before the banking committee when Frank Dodd was passed, and that was the closest and biggest effort to change. And actually, it would have diminished the number of investors greatly because they were going to index it to inflation, and it was insane. But they haven't done anything, I don't think, with the definition since that time.
No, they have not. And I'll throw in an interesting statistic here from our data. And this is probably maybe not particular to Montana based on something Maggie told us at our table, but in many parts of off the coast, out of the capital hubs, you can be in the top 10% of adjusted gross income in your state and not meet the wealth thresholds for accredited investor. So I think this is something when people are talking about how do you change the definition, that sometimes it's around how do we allow people who maybe aren't sort of in that top 10% AGI, but how do we bring more people in? But also thinking about it from the perspective of in rural parts of America, making, $100,000 is the same as making $200,000 or $300,000 if you live someplace like I live in Washington, D.C. So trying to figure out those discrepancies. I wish I had a magic wand and I knew how you fixed it, and I don't.
I'm thinking of this through the lens of buying real estate under like a syndication, right? And say your friends and family, some are accredited, some are not. That seems under the 506B umbrella.
Right.
Is there something that would trigger an audit or anything? Like, what do you have to be aware of or be on the lookout for to make the correct boxes you have to check to ensure that if there were to be an audit, that you're playing by the rules? Is that talk to an attorney or?
That's probably talk to an attorney, but I'll say this. I mean, you want to understand the regulations under 506B. So when you're thinking about whether you're doing that or any offering, you always want to make sure you're complying with the rules and regulations. I mean, that at the forefront is the best way to protect yourself as someone who's raising capital. So yeah, I think I have to leave it at that. If you want to talk to me out in the hall and off the record, we can do that too.
I'll answer it. This is off the record. I'm a securities lawyer. I've heard so many times, Uncle Joe's not accredited, but he's not going to sue me.
Right.
Right. But Uncle Joe doesn't have to sue you. If I invest in the same round of financing or even a later round of financing, and I'm an accredited investor, and then I find out that you sold stock to Uncle Joe in violation of the securities laws, I'm going to sue you to get my money back. So it's not Uncle Joe suing you.
Thank you. Not allowed to give legal advice in my role. Anything else? Well, thanks for your time today. I really hope you'll check out our resources. There's some really great stuff there. And I think we have got one more amazing session coming up, or two.